The Book of the Maccabees, Tiles. It came to pass, after that Alexander the Macedonian, the son of Philip, who came out of the land of Chittim and struck Darius king of the Persians and Medes, it came to pass, after he had struck him, that he reigned in his stead in former time over Greece. And he fought many battles and won many strongholds and killed the kings of the earth and went through to the ends of the earth and took the spoils of a multitude of nations. And the earth was quiet before him, and he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. And he gathered together an exceedingly strong army, and ruled over countries and nations and principalities, and they became tributary to him. And after these things he fell sick, and perceived that he should die. And he called his servants, which were honorable, which had been brought up with him from his youth, and he divided to them his kingdom, while he was yet alive. And Alexander reigned 12 years, and he died. And his servants bare rule, each one in his place. And they did all put diadems on themselves after that he was dead. And so did their sons after them many years. And they multiplied evils in the earth. And there came out of them a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been a hostage at Rome. And he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days there came out of Israel transgressors of the law, and persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the nations that are around us. For since we were parted from them, many evils have befallen us. And the saying was good in their eyes. And certain of the people were forward herein, and went to the king, and he gave them license to do after the ordinances of the nations. And they built a place of exercise in Jerusalem according to the laws of the nations. And they made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the nations, and sold themselves to do evil. And the kingdom was well ordered in the sight of Antiochus, and he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might reign over the two kingdoms. And he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots, and with elephants, and with horsemen, and with a great navy. And he made war against Ptolemy king of Egypt. And Ptolemy was put to shame before him, and fled, and many fell wounded to death. And they got possession of the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils of Egypt. And Antiochus, after he had struck Egypt, returned in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered presumptuously into the sanctuary, and took the golden altar, and the candlestick of the light, and all that pertained to that, and the table of the bread of the presentation, and the cups to pour with, and the bowls, and the golden censers, and the veil, and the crowns, and the adorning of gold which was on the face of the temple, and he peeled it all off. And he took the silver and the gold and the precious vessels, and he took the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all, he went away into his own land, and he made a great slaughter, and spoke very presumptuously. And there came great mourning in Israel, in every place where they were. And the rulers and elders groaned, the virgins and young men were made feeble, and the beauty of the women was changed. Every bridegroom took up lamentation. She that sat in the marriage chamber was in heaviness. And the land was moved for the inhabitants thereof, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. And after 2 full years the king sent a chief collector of tribute to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a great multitude. And he spoke words of peace to them in subtlety, and they gave him credence. And he fell on the city suddenly and struck it very severely, and destroyed many people out of Israel. And he took the spoils of the city, and set it on fire, and pulled down the houses thereof, and the walls thereof on every side. And they led captive the women and the children, and the cattle they took in possession. And they built the city of David with a great and strong wall, with strong towers, and it became to them a citadel. And they put there a sinful nation, transgressors of the law, and they strengthened themselves therein. And they stored up arms and food, and gathering together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there, and they became a severe snare, and it became a place to lie in wait in against the sanctuary, and an evil adversary to Israel continually. And they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary, and defiled the sanctuary. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them, and she became a habitation of strangers, and she became strange to those who were born in her, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness, Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. According to her glory, so was her dishonor multiplied, and her high estate was turned into mourning. And King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that each should forsake his own laws. And all the nations agreed according to the word of the king, and many of Israel consented to his worship, and sacrificed to the idols, and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by the hand of messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow laws strange to the land, and should forbid whole burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the sanctuary, and should profane the Sabbaths and feasts, and pollute the sanctuary and those who were holy, that they should build altars and temples and shrines for idols, and should sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, and that they should leave their sons uncircumcised, that they should make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, so that they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whoever will not do according to the word of the king, he will die. According to all these words he wrote to his whole kingdom, and he appointed overseers over all the people, and he commanded the cities of Judah to sacrifice, city by city. And from the people were gathered together to them many, everyone that had forsaken the law. And they did evil things in the land, and they made Israel to hide themselves in every place of refuge which they had. And on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they built an abomination of desolation on the altar. And in the cities of Judah on every side they built idol altars. And at the doors of the houses and in the streets they burned incense. And they tore in pieces the scrolls of the law which they found, and set them on fire. And wherever was found with a scroll of the covenant, and if any consented to the law, the king's sentence delivered him to death. So did they in their might to Israel, to those that were found month by month in the cities. And on the 25th day of the month, they sacrificed on the idol altar of God. And the women that had circumcised their children they put to death according to the command. And they hanged their babies about their necks, and destroyed their houses and those who had circumcised them. And many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat unclean things. And they chose to die, that they might not be defiled with the meat, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. And they died. And there came exceedingly great wrath on Israel. In those days Mattathias rose up, the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest of the sons of Joarib, from Jerusalem, and he lived at Modin. And he had 5 sons, John, who was surnamed Gaddis, Simon, who was called Thassi, Judas, who was called Maccabeus, Eleazar, who was called Avaran, Jonathan, who was called Aphas. And he saw the blasphemies that were committed in Judah and in Jerusalem. And he said, Woe is me! Why was I born to see the destruction of my people and the destruction of the holy city, and to dwell there when it was given into the hand of the enemy, the sanctuary into the hand of aliens? Her temple has become as a man that was glorious. Her vessels of glory are carried away into captivity. Her infants are slain in her streets, her young men with the sword of the enemy. What nation has not inherited her palaces and gotten possession of her spoils? Her adorning is all taken away. Instead of a free woman, she has become a bondwoman. And behold, our holy things and our beauty and our glory are laid waste, and the nations have profaned them. Why should we live any longer? And Mattathias and his sons tore their clothes and put on sackcloth, and mourned exceedingly. And the king's officers that were enforcing the apostasy came into the city Modin to sacrifice. And many of Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were gathered together. And the king's officers answered and spoke to Mattathias, saying, You are a ruler and an honorable and great man in this city, and strengthened with sons and relatives. Now therefore come first and do the command of the king, as all the nations have done, and the men of Judah and those who remain in Jerusalem. And you and your house will be in the number of the king's friends, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. And Mattathias answered and said with a loud voice, If all the nations that are in the house of the king's dominion listen to him, to each one fall away from the worship of his fathers, and have made choice to follow his commands, yet I and my sons and my relatives will walk in the covenant of our fathers. Heaven forbids that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not listen to the king's words, to go aside from our worship on the right hand or on the left. And when he had left speaking these words, there came a Jew in the sight of all, to sacrifice on the altar which was at Modin, according to the king's command. And Mattathias saw it, and his zeal was kindled, and his reins trembled, and he showed out his wrath according to judgment, and ran and killed him on the altar. And the king's officer who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at that time and pulled down the altar. And he was zealous for the law, even as Phinehas did to Zimri, the son of Salu. And Mattathias cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, "Whoever is zealous for the law and maintains the covenant, let him come out after me." And he and his sons fled into the mountains and forsook all that they had in the city. Then many that sought after justice and judgment went down into the wilderness, to dwell there, they and their sons, and their wives and their cattle, because evils were multiplied on them. And it was told the king's officers, and the forces that were in Jerusalem, the city of David, that certain men who had broken the king's command were gone down into the secret places in the wilderness. And many pursued after them, and having overtaken them, they encamped against them, and set the battle in array against them on the Sabbath day. And they said to them, "Sophar, come out, and do according to the word of the king, and you will live." And they said, "We will not come out, neither will we do the word of the king, to profane the Sabbath day." And they hurried to give them battle. And they did not answer them, neither did they cast a stone at them, nor stopped up the secret places, saying, "Let us die all in our innocence. The heavens and earth witness over us, that you put us to death without trial." And they rose up against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they died, they and their wives and their children and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 souls. And Mattathias and his friends knew it, and they mourned over them exceedingly. And one said to another, "If we all do as our countrymen have done, and fight not against the nations for our lives and our ordinances, they will now quickly destroy us from off the earth." And they took counsel on that day, saying, "Whoever will come against us to battle on the Sabbath day, let us fight against him, and we will in no way all die, as our countrymen died in the secret places." Then were gathered together to them a company of Hasideans, mighty men of Israel, every one that offered himself willingly for the law. And all those who fled from the evils were added to them and became a stay to them. And they mustered an army and struck sinners in their anger and lawless men in their wrath. And the rest fled to the nations for safety. And Mattathias and his friends went around and pulled down the altars. And they circumcised by force the children that were uncircumcised, as many as they found in the coasts of Israel. And they pursued after the sons of pride, and the work prospered in their hand. And they rescued the law out of the hand of the nations, and out of the hand of the kings, neither suffered they the sinner to triumph. And the days of Mattathias drew near that he should die. And he said to his sons, "Now have pride and rebuke gotten strength in a season of overthrow and wrath of indignation. And now, my children, be zealous for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers, and call to remembrance the deeds of our fathers which they did in their generations, and receive great glory and a perpetual name. Was not Abraham found faithful in temptation, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness? Joseph in the time of his distress kept the command and became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas our father, for that he was zealous exceedingly, obtained the covenant of a perpetual priesthood. Joshua, for fulfilling the word, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, for bearing witness in the congregation, obtained a heritage in the land. David, for being merciful, inherited the throne of a kingdom forever and ever. Elijah, for that he was exceedingly zealous for the law, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael believed, and were saved out of the flame. Daniel, for his innocence, was delivered from the mouth of lions. And so consider you from generation to generation, that none that put their trust in him will lack for strength. And do not be afraid of the words of a sinful man, for his glory will be dung and worms. Today he will be lifted up, and tomorrow he will in no way be found, because he is returned to his dust, and his thoughts have perished. And you, my children, be strong, and show yourselves men on behalf of the law, for therein will you obtain glory. And he blessed them and was gathered with his fathers. And he died in the 146th year, and his sons buried him in the tombs of his fathers at Modin, and all Israel made great lamentation for him. And his son Judas, who was called Maccabeus, rose up in his stead. And all his countrymen helped him, and so did all those who cleaved to his father, and they fought with gladness the battle of Israel. And he got his people great glory, and put on a breastplate as a giant, and girded his warlike harness about him, and set battles in array, protecting the army with his sword. And he was like a lion in his deeds, and as a lion's whelp roaring for prey. And he pursued the lawless, seeking them out, and he burned up those that troubled his people. And the lawless shrunk for fear of him, and all the workers of lawlessness were severely troubled, and salvation prospered in his hand. And he angered many kings and made Jacob glad about his acts, and his memorial is blessed forever. And he went around among the cities of Judah, and destroyed the ungodly out of the land, and turned away wrath from Israel. And he was renowned to the utmost part of the earth, and he gathered together such as were ready to perish. And Apollonius gathered the nations together, and a great army from Samaria, to fight against Israel. And Judas perceived it, and he went out to meet him, and struck him, and killed him. And many fell wounded to death, and the rest fled. And they took their spoils, and Judas took the sword of Apollonius, and with that he fought all his days. And Seron, the commander of the army of Syria, heard it said that Judas had gathered a gathering and a congregation of faithful men with him, and of such as went out to war. And he said, I will make myself a name, and get me glory in the kingdom. And I will fight against Judas and those who are with him, that set at nothing the word of the king. And there went up with him also a mighty army of the ungodly to help him, to take vengeance on the sons of Israel. And he came near to the going up of Betharon, and Judas went out to meet him with a small company. But when they saw the army coming to meet them, they said to Judas, What? Will we be able, being a small company, to fight against so great and strong a multitude? And we for our part are faint, having tasted no food this day. And Judas said, It is an easy thing for many to be shut up in the hands of a few. And with heaven it is all one, to save by many or by few. For victory in battle stands not in the multitude of an army, but strength is from heaven. They come to us in fullness of insolence and lawlessness, to destroy us and our wives and our children, for to plunder us. But we fight for our lives and our laws, and he himself will defeat them before our face. But as for you, do not be afraid of them. Now when he had left off speaking, he leapt suddenly on them, and Seron and his army were defeated before him. And they pursued them in the going down of Beth-horon to the plain, and there fell off them about 800 men. But the residue fled into the land of the Philistines. And the fear of Judas and his countrymen, and the dread of them, began to fall on the nations around them, and his name came near even to the king, and every nation told of the battles of Judas. But when King Antiochus heard these words, he was full of indignation, and he sent and gathered together all the forces of his realm, an exceedingly strong army. And he opened his treasury, and gave his forces pay for a year, and commanded them to be ready for every need. And he saw that the money failed from his treasures, and that the tributes of the country were small, because of the dissension and plague which he had brought on the land, to the end that he might take away the laws which had been from the first days. And he feared that he should not have enough as at other times for the charges and the gifts which he gave previously with a liberal hand. And he abounded above the kings that were before him. And he was exceedingly perplexed in his mind, and he was determined to go into Persia, and to take the tributes of the countries, and to gather much money. And he left Lysias, an honorable man, and one of the seed royals, to be over the affairs of the king from the river Euphrates to the borders of Egypt, and to bring up his son Antiochus until he came again. And he delivered to him the half of his forces and the elephants, and gave him charge of all the things that he would have done, in concerning those who lived in Judea and in Jerusalem, that he should send an army against them, to root out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem, and to take away their memorial from the place, in that he should make strangers to dwell on all their coasts, and should divide their land to them by lot. And the king took the half that remained of the forces, and removed from Antioch from his royal city, the 147th year, and he passed over the river Euphrates, and went through the upper countries. And Lysias chose Ptolemy the son of Doramenes, and Nicanor and Gorgias, mighty men of the king's friends, and with them he sent 40,000 footmen and 7,000 horses to go into the land of Judah and to destroy it according to the word of the king. And they removed with all their army and came and pitched near to Emmaus in the plain country. And the merchants of the country heard the fame of them, and took silver and gold exceedingly much, with chains, and came into the camp to take the sons of Israel for servants. And there were added to them the forces of Syria and of the land of the Philistines. And Judas and his countrymen saw that evils were multiplied, and that the forces were encamping in their borders. And they took knowledge of the king's words which he had commanded, to destroy the people and make an end of them. And they said each man to his neighbor, let us raise up the ruin of our people, and let us fight for our people in the holy place. And the congregation was gathered together, that they might be ready for battle, and that they might pray and ask for mercy and compassion. And Jerusalem was without inhabitant as a wilderness. There was none of her offspring that went in or went out. And the sanctuary was trodden down, and the sons of strangers were in the citadel. The nations lodged therein. And joy was taken away from Jacob, and the pipe and the harp ceased. And they gathered themselves together and came to Mizpeh near Jerusalem. For in Mizpeh was there a place of prayer previously for Israel. And they fasted that day, and put on sackcloth, and put ashes on their heads, and tore their clothes, and laid open the scroll of the law, concerning which the nations were accustomed to inquiring, seeking the likenesses of their idols. And they brought the priests' garments, and the firstfruits, and the tithes, and they stirred up the Nazarites who had accomplished their days. And they cried aloud toward heaven, saying, what will we do with these men, and where will we carry them away? And your holy place is trodden down and profaned, and your priests are in heaviness and brought low. And behold, the nations are assembled together against us to destroy us. You know what things they imagine against us. How will we be able to stand before them, except you be our help? And they sounded with the trumpets and cried with a loud voice. And after this, Judas appointed leaders of the people, captains of thousands, and captains of hundreds, and captains of fifties, and captains of tens. And he said to those who were building houses, and were betrothing wives, and were planting vineyards, and were fearful, that they should return each man to his own house, according to the law. And the army removed and encamped on the south side of Emmaus. And Judas said, gird yourselves and be valiant men, and be in readiness against the morning, that you may fight with these nations that are assembled together against us to destroy us in our holy place. For it is better for us to die in battle than to look on the evils of our nation in the holy place. Nevertheless, as may be the will in heaven, so will he do. And Gorgias took 5,000 footmen and 1,000 chosen horses, and the army removed by night, that it might fall on the army of the Jews and strike them suddenly. And the men of the citadel were his guides. And Judas heard thereof, and removed he and the valiant men, that he might strike the king's army which was at Emmaus, while as yet the forces were dispersed from the camp. And Gorgias came into the camp of Judas by night, and found no man. And he sought them in the mountains, for he said, these men flee from us. And as soon as it was day, Judas appeared in the plain with 3,000 men. However, they did not have the armor and swords they desired. And they saw the camp of the nations strong and fortified, and horsemen compassing it around. And these were experts in war. And Judas said to the men that were with him, do not fear their multitude, neither be afraid of their onset. Remember how our fathers were saved in the Red Sea, when Pharaoh pursued them with an army? And now let us cry to heaven, if he will have us, and will remember the covenant of our fathers, and destroy this army before our face today. And all the nations will know that there is one who redeems and saves Israel. And the strangers lifted up their eyes and saw them coming near them, and they went out of the camp to battle. And Judas said to Simon his brother, choose out men, and go and deliver your countrymen that are in Galilee. But my brother Jonathan and I will go into the land of Gilead. And he left Joseph the son of Zechariah and Azariah as leaders of the people, with the remnant of the army in Judea, for to keep it. And he gave command to them, saying, take you the charge of this people, and fight no battle with the nations until that we come again. And to Simon were divided 3,000 men to go into Galilee, but to Judas 8,000 men to go into the land of Gilead. And Simon went into Galilee and fought many battles with the nations, and the nations were defeated before him. And he pursued them to the gate of Ptolemais. And there fell of the nations about 3,000 men, and he took their spoils. And they took to them those that were in Galilee and in Arbata, with their wives and their children, and all that they had, and brought them into Judea with great gladness. And Judas Maccabeus and his brother Jonathan passed over Jordan, and went 3 days' journey in the wilderness. And they met with the Nabateans, and these met them in a peaceful manner, and told them all things that had befallen their countrymen in the land of Gilead, and how that many of them were shut up in Bosora, and Bosor, and Alama, Casphor, Maked, and Karnaim. All these cities are strong and great, and how that they were shut up in the rest of the cities of the land of Gilead, and that tomorrow they have appointed to encamp against the strongholds, and to take them, and to destroy all these men in one day. And Judas and his army turned suddenly by the way of the wilderness to Bosora, and he took the city and killed all the males with the edge of the sword, and took all their spoils and burned the city with fire. And he left from there by night and went until he came to the stronghold. And the morning came, and they lifted up their eyes, and behold, many people which could not be counted, bearing ladders and engines of war, to take the stronghold. And they were fighting against them. And Judas saw that the battle was begun, and that the cry of the city went up to heaven, with trumpets and a great sound. And he said to the men of his army, "Fight this day for your countrymen." And he went out behind them in 3 companies, and they sounded with their trumpets, and cried out in prayer. And the army of Mattathias perceived that it was Maccabeus, and they fled from before him. And he struck them with a great slaughter. And there fell of them on that day about 8,000 men. And he turned away to Mizpeh, and fought against it, and took it, and killed all the males thereof, and took the spoils thereof, and burned it with fire. From there he left, and took Casphor, Maked, Bosor, and the other cities of the land of Gilead. Now after these things Mattathias gathered another army, and encamped near Raphon beyond the brook. And Judas sent men to spy on the army. And they brought him word, saying, "All the nations that are around us are gathered together to them, an exceedingly great army. And they have hired Arabians to help them, and are encamping beyond the brook, ready to come against you to battle." And Judas went to meet them. And Mattathias said to the captains of his army, "When Judas and his army drew near to the brook of water, if he passes over first to us, we will not be able to withstand him, for he will mightily prevail against us. But if he be afraid, and encamp beyond the river, we will cross over to him and prevail against him." Now when Judas came near to the brook of water, he caused the scribes of the people to remain by the brook, and gave command to them, saying, "Permit no man to encamp, but let all come to the battle." And he crossed over the first against them, and all the people after him, and all the nations were defeated before his face, and cast away their arms, and fled to the temple at Karnaim. And they took the city, and burned the temple with fire, together with all that were therein. And Karnaim was subdued, neither could they stand any longer before the face of Judas. And Judas gathered together all Israel, those who were in the land of Gilead, from the least to the greatest, and their wives and their children and their stuff, an exceedingly great army, that they might come into the land of Judah. And they came as far as Ephron, and this same city was great, and it was in the way as they should go, exceedingly strong. They could not turn away from it on the right hand or on the left, but must necessarily pass through the midst of it. And they of the city shut them out, and stopped up the gates with stones. And Judas sent to them with words of peace, saying, "We will pass through your land to go into our own land, and none will do you any harm. We will only pass by on our feet." And they would not open to him. And Judas commanded a proclamation to be made in the army, that each man should encamp in the place where he was. And the men of the army encamped and fought against the city all that day and all that night. And the city was delivered into his hands. And he destroyed all the males with the edge of the sword, and razed the city, and took the spoils thereof, and passed through the city over those who were slain. And they went over Jordan into the great plain near Bethshan. And Judas gathered together those that lagged behind, and encouraged the people all the way through, until he came into the land of Judah. And they went up to Mount Zion with gladness and joy, and offered whole burnt offerings, because not so much as one of them was slain until they returned in peace. And in the days when Judas and Jonathan were in the land of Gilead, and Simon his brother in Galilee before Ptolemaeus, Joseph the son of Zechariah, and Azariah, rulers of the army, heard of their exploits and of the war, what things they had done. And they said, "Let us also get us a name, and let us go fight against the nations that are around us." And they gave charge to the men of the army that was with them, and went toward Jamnia. And Gorius and his men came out of the city to meet them in battle. And Joseph and Azariah were put to flight, and were pursued to the borders of Judea. And there fell on that day of the people of Israel about 2,000 men. And there was a great overthrow among the people, because they did not listen to Judas and his countrymen, thinking to do some exploit. But they were not of the seed of those men, by whose hand deliverance was given to Israel. And the man Judas and his countrymen were glorified exceedingly in the sight of all Israel, and of all the nations, wherever their name was heard of. And men gathered together to them, acclaiming them. And Judas and his countrymen went out and fought against the children of Esau in the land toward the south. And he struck Hebron and the villages thereof, and pulled down the strongholds thereof, and burned the towers thereof. And he left to go into the land of the Philistines, and he went through Samaria. On that day certain priests, desiring to do exploits there, were slain in battle, when he went out to battle unadvisedly. And Judas turned toward Azotus, to the land of the Philistines, and pulled down their altars, and burned the carved images of their gods with fire, and took the plunder of their cities, and returned into the land of Judah. And King Antiochus was journeying through the upper countries. And he heard it said that in Elamai in Persia there was a city renowned for riches, for silver and gold, and that the temple which was in it was exceedingly rich, and that therein were golden shields and breastplates and arms, which Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian king, who reigned first among the Greeks, left behind there. And he came and sought to take the city and to pillage it. And he was not able, because the thing was known to them of the city, and they rose up against him to battle, and he fled, and left from there with great heaviness to return to Babylon. And there came one bringing him tidings into Persia, that the armies which went against the land of Judah had been put to flight, and that Lysias went first with a strong army, and was put to shame before them, and that they had waxed strong by reason of arms and power, and with store of spoils, which they took from the armies that they had cut off, and that they had pulled down the abomination which he had built on the altar that was in Jerusalem, and that they had compassed about the sanctuary with high walls as before, in Bethsura his city. And it came to pass, when the king heard these words, he was astonished and moved exceedingly. And he laid down on his bed, and fell sick with grief, because it had not befallen him as he looked for. And he was there many days, because great grief was renewed on him, and he made account that he should die. And he called for all his friends, and said to them, "Sleep departs from my eyes, and my heart fails for care. And I said in my heart, to what suffering am I come? And how great a flood is it, wherein I now am? For I was gracious and beloved in my power. But now I remember the evils which I did at Jerusalem, and that I took all the vessels of silver and gold that were therein, and sent out to destroy the inhabitants of Judah without a cause. I perceive that on this account these evils have come on me, and behold, I perish through great grief in a strange land." And he called for Philip, one of his friends, and set him over all his kingdom, and gave him his diadem, and his robe, and his signet ring, to the end he should bring Antiochus his son, and nourish him up that he might be king. And King Antiochus died there in the 149th year. And Lysias knew that the king was dead, and he set up Antiochus his son to reign, whom he had nourished up being young, and he called his name Eupator. And those who were in the citadel shut up Israel around the sanctuary, and sought always their hurt and the strengthening of the nations. And Judas thought to destroy them, and called all the people together to besiege them. And they were gathered together and besieged them in the 150th year. And he made mounds to shoot from, and engines of war. And there came out some of those who were shut up, and there were joined to them certain ungodly men of Israel. And they went to the king and said, "How long will you not execute judgment and avenge our countrymen? We were willing to serve your father, and to walk after his words, and to follow his commands. And for this reason the children of our people besieged the citadel, and were alienated from us. But as many of us as they could descend on, they killed and plundered our inheritances. And not against us only did they stretch out their hand, but also against all their borders. And behold, they are encamped this day against the citadel at Jerusalem to take it. And they have fortified the sanctuary in Bethsura. And if you are not beforehand with them quickly, they will do greater things than these, and you will not be able to control them. And when the king heard this, he was angry, and gathered together all his friends, and even the rulers of his army, and those who were over the horse. And there came to him from other kingdoms, and from isles of the sea, bands of hired soldiers. And the number of his forces was 100,000 footmen, and 20,000 horsemen, and 32 elephants trained for war. And they went through Idumea, and encamped against Bethsura, and fought against it many days, and made engines of war. And they of Bethsura came out, and burned them with fire, and fought valiantly. And Judas left from the citadel, and encamped at Bethzacharias, near the king's camp. And the king rose early in the morning, and sent his army at full speed along the road to Bethzacharias, and his forces made them ready to battle, and sounded with the trumpets. And they showed the elephants the blood of grapes and mulberries, that they might prepare them for the battle. And they divided the beasts among the phalanxes, and they set by each elephant 1,000 men armed with coats of mail, and helmets of brass on their heads. And for each beast were appointed 500 chosen horsemen. These were ready beforehand, wherever the beast was, and wherever the beast went, they went with him. They did not depart from him. And towers of wood were on them, strong and covered, one on each beast, girded fast on him with cunning contrivances. And on each beast were 32 valiant men that fought on them, beside his Indian, and the residue of the horsemen he set on this side and that side at the two parts of the army, striking terror into the enemy, and protected by the phalanxes. Now when the sun shone on the shields of gold and brass, the mountains shone with them, and blazed like torches of fire. And a part of the king's army was spread on the high mountains, and some on the low ground. And they went on firmly and in order. And all that heard the noise of their multitude, and the marching of the multitude, and the rattling of the arms, did quake. For the army was exceedingly great and strong. And Judas and his army drew near for battle, and there fell of the king's army 600 men. And Eleazar, who was called Avaran, saw one of the beasts armed with royal breastplates, and he was higher than all the beasts, and the king seemed to be on him. And he gave himself to deliver his people, and to get himself a perpetual name. And he ran on him courageously into the midst of the phalanx, and killed on the right hand and on the left. And they separated apart from him on this side and on that. And he crept under the elephant, and thrust him from beneath, and killed him. And the elephant fell to the earth on him, and he died there. And they saw the strength of the kingdom, and the fierce onset of the army, and turned away from them. But they of the king's army went up to Jerusalem to meet them, and the king encamped toward Judea, and toward Mount Zion. And he made peace with them of Bethsura. And he came out of the city, because they had no food there to endure the siege, because it was a Sabbath to the land. And the king took Bethsura, and appointed a garrison there to keep it. And he encamped against the sanctuary many days, and set their mounds to shoot from, and engines of war, and instruments for casting fire and stones, and pieces to cast darts and slings. And they also made engines against their engines, and fought for many days. But there was no food in the sanctuary, because it was the 7th year, and those who fled for safety into Judea from among the nations had eaten up the residue of the store. And there were but a few left in the sanctuary, because the famine prevailed against them, and they were scattered, each man to his own place. And Lysias heard it said that Philip, whom Antiochus the king, while he was yet alive, appointed to nourish up his son Antiochus, that he might be king, had returned from Persia and Media, and with him the forces that went with the king, and that he was seeking to take the government to himself. And he hurried, and gave consent to depart. And he said to the king and the leaders of the army and to the men, "We decay daily, and our food is scant, and the place where we encamp is strong, and the affairs of the kingdom lie on us. Now therefore let us give the right hand to these men, and make peace with them and with all their nation, and covenant with them, that they will walk after their own laws as previously, for because of their laws which we abolished, they were angered, and did all these things." And the saying pleased the king and the princes, And he sent to them to make peace, and they accepted thereof. And the king and the princes swore to them. Immediately they came out from the stronghold. And the king entered into Mount Zion. And he saw the strength of the place, and set at nothing the oath which he had sworn, and gave command to pull down the wall around. And he left in haste, and returned to Antioch, and found Philip master of the city. And he fought against him, and took the city by force. In the 150th year, Demetrius the son of Seleucus came out from Rome, and went up with a few men to a city by the sea, and reigned there. And it came to pass, when he would go into the house of the kingdom of his fathers, that the army laid hands on Antiochus and Lysias to bring them to him. And the thing was known to him, and he said, "Do not show me their faces." And the army killed them. And Demetrius sat on the throne of his kingdom. And there came to him all the lawless and ungodly men of Israel. And Alcimus was their leader, desiring to be chief priest. And they accused the people to the king, saying, "Judas and his countrymen have destroyed all your friends, and have scattered us from our own land. Now therefore send a man whom you trust, and let him go and see all the havoc which he has made of us, and of the king's country, and how he has punished them, and all that helped them." And the king chose Maccabees, one of the king's friends, who was ruler in the country beyond the river, and was a great man in the kingdom, and faithful to the king. And he sent him, and that ungodly Alcimus, and made sure to him the chief priesthood, and he commanded him to take vengeance on the sons of Israel. And they went and came with a great army into the land of Judah. And he sent messengers to Judas and his countrymen with words of peace deceitfully, and they gave no heed to their words, for they saw that they were coming with a great army. And they were gathered together with Alcimus and Maccabees, a company of scribes, to seek justice. And the Hasideans were the first among the sons of Israel that sought peace from them, for they said, "One that is a priest of the seed of Aaron has come with the forces, and he will do us no wrong." And he spoke with them words of peace, and swore to them, saying, "We will seek the hurt neither of you nor your friends." And they gave him credence. And he laid hands on 60 men of them, and killed them in one day, according to the word which the psalmist wrote. "The flesh of your saints they cast out, and their blood they shed around Jerusalem, and there was no man to bury them. And the fear and the dread of them fell on all the people. For they said, There is neither truth nor judgment in them, for they have broken the covenant and the oath which they swore." And Maccabees left from Jerusalem and encamped in Bezeth. And he sent and took away many of the deserters that were with him, and certain of the people, and he killed them, and cast them into the great pit. And he made sure the country to Alcimus, and left with him a force to aid him. And Maccabees went away to the king. And Alcimus strove for his chief priesthood. And there were gathered to him all those who troubled their people, and they got the mastery of the land of Judah, and did great hurt in Israel. And Judas saw all the mischief that Alcimus and his company had done among the sons of Israel, even above the nations. And he went out into all the surrounding coasts of Judea, and took vengeance on the men that had deserted from him. And they were restrained from going out into the country. But when Alcimus saw that Judas and his company waxed strong, and knew that he was not able to withstand them, he returned to the king, and brought evil accusations against them. And the king sent Nicanor, one of his honorable princes, a man that hated Israel and was their enemy, and commanded him to destroy the people. And Nicanor came to Jerusalem with a great army. And he sent to Judas and his countrymen deceitfully with words of peace, saying, "Let there be no battle between me and you. I will come with a few men, that I may see your faces in peace." And he came to Judas, and they saluted one another peaceably. And the enemies were ready to take away Judas by violence. And the thing was known to Judas, that he came to him with deceit, and he was severely afraid of him, and would see his face no longer. And Nicanor knew that his counsel was discovered. And he went out to meet Judas in battle beside Capharsalama. And there fell of Nicanor's side about 500 men, and they fled into the city of David. And after these things Nicanor went up to Mount Zion, and there came some of the priests out of the sanctuary, and some of the elders of the people, to salute him peaceably, and to show him the whole burnt sacrifice that was being offered for the king. And he mocked them, and laughed at them, and entreated them shamefully, and spoke haughtily, and swore in a rage, saying, "Unless Judas and his army are now delivered into my hands, It will be that, if I come again in peace, I will burn up this house." And he went out in a great rage. And the priests entered in and stood before the altar and the temple. And they wept and said, "You chose this house to be called by your name, to be a house of prayer and supplication for your people. Take vengeance on this man and his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies, and do not allow them to live any longer." And Nicanor went out from Jerusalem and encamped in Betharon, and there met him the army of Syria. And Judas encamped in Adasa with 3,000 men. And Judas prayed and said, "When those who came from the king blasphemed, your messenger went out and struck among them 185,000. Even so defeat this army before us today, and let all the rest know that he has spoken wickedly against your sanctuary, and judge him according to his wickedness." And on the 13th day of the month, the armies joined battle. And Nicanor's army was defeated, and he himself was the first to fall in the battle. Now when his army saw that Nicanor was fallen, they cast away their arms and fled. And they pursued after them a day's journey from Adasa until you come to Gazara. And they sounded an alarm after them with the solemn trumpets. And they came out of all the surrounding villages of Judea and closed them in. And these turned them back on those. And they all fell by the sword, and there was not one of them left. And they took the spoils and the plunder, and they struck off Nicanor's head and his right hand, which he stretched out so haughtily, and brought them, and hanged them up beside Jerusalem. And the people were exceedingly glad, and they kept that day as a day of great gladness. And they ordained to keep this day year by year, the 13th day of Adar. And the land of Judah had rested a little while. And Judas heard of the fame of the Romans, that they are valiant men, and have pleasure in all that join themselves to them, and make friends with all such as come to them, and that they are valiant men. And they told him of their wars and exploits which they do among the Gauls, and how that they conquered them, and brought them under tribute, and what things they did in the land of Spain, that they might become masters of the mines of silver and gold which were there, and how that by their policy and persistence they conquered all the place, and the place was exceedingly far from them, and the kings that came against them from the uttermost part of the earth, until they had defeated them, and struck them very severely, and how the rest give them tribute year by year. And Philip and Perseus, king of Chittim, and those who lifted up themselves against them, did they defeat in battle, and conquered them. Antiochus also, the great king of Asia, who came against them to battle, having 120 elephants, with horse and chariots, and an exceedingly great army, and he was defeated by them. And they took him alive, and appointed that both he and such as reigned after him should give them a great tribute, and should give hostages, and a parcel of land, the country of India, and Media, and Lydia, and of the attractive of their countries. And they took them from him, and gave them to King Eumenes. And how they of Greece took counsel to come and destroy them. And the thing was known to them, and they sent against them a captain, and fought against them. And many of them fell down wounded to death. And they made captive their wives and their children, and plundered them, and conquered their land, and pulled down their strongholds, and plundered them, and brought them into bondage to this day. And the residue of the kingdoms and of the isles, as many as rose up against them at any time, they destroyed and made them to be their servants. But with their friends and such as relied on them, they stayed friends. And they conquered the kingdoms that were near, and those that were far off, and all that heard of their fame were afraid of them. Moreover, whoever they will to help and to make kings, these do they make kings, and whoever they will do they depose, and they are exalted exceedingly. And for all this none of them ever put on a diadem, neither did they clothe themselves with purple, to be magnified by it. And how they had made for themselves a senate house, and day by day 320 men sat in council, always consulting for the people, to the end they might be well ordered. And how they commit their government to one man year by year, that he should rule over them, and be lord over all their country, and all are obedient to that one. And there is neither envy nor emulation among them. And Judas chose Eupolemus the son of John, the son of Achos, and Jason the son of Eleazar, and sent them to Rome, to establish friendship and alliance with them, and that they should take the yoke from them. For they saw that the kingdom of the Greeks kept Israel in bondage. And they went to Rome, and the way was exceedingly long. And they entered into the Senate house, and answered and said, Judas, who is also called Maccabeus, and his countrymen, and the people of the Jews, have sent us to you, to make a confederacy and peace with you, and that we might be registered your allies and friends. And the thing was well-pleasing in their sight. And this is the copy of the writing which they wrote back again on tablets of brass, and sent to Jerusalem, that it might be with them there for a memorial of peace and confederacy. Good success be to the Romans and to the nation of the Jews, by sea and by land forever, the sword also, and the enemy be far from them. But if war arise for Rome first, or any of their allies in all their dominion, the nation of the Jews will help them as allies, as the occasion will prescribe to them, with all their heart. And to those who make war on them they will not give, neither supply, food, arms, money, or ships, as it has seemed good to Rome, and they will keep their ordinances without taking anything therefore. In the same manner, moreover, if war comes first on the nation of the Jews, the Romans will help them as allies with all their soul, as the occasion will prescribe to them, and to those who are allies with their enemies. There will not be given food, arms, money, or ships, as it has seemed good to Rome, and they will keep these ordinances, and that without deceit. According to these words, the Romans made a covenant with the people of the Jews. But if hereafter the one party and the other will take counsel to add or diminish anything, they will do it at their pleasure, and whatever they will add or take away will be established. And as touching the evils which King Demetrius does to them, we have written to him, saying, Why have you made your yoke heavy on our friends and allies the Jews? If therefore they plead any more against you, we will do them justice, and fight with you by sea and by land.